Ed Kemper, the co-ed killer, a mind too smart for mercy. He spoke with perfect composure. His words were clear, thoughtful, even polite. But every sentence came from a man who had taken 10 lives. In the 1970s, California was haunted by a murderer unlike any other. Not because of what he did, but because of how he understood it. His name was Edmund Kemper, a man of intelligence so striking that FBI profilers would later study his mind to understand how monsters hide in plain sight. He was 6'9", soft-spoken, articulate, and deeply broken. What began as a childhood marked by isolation and rejection would spiral into one of the most disturbing chapters in American criminal history. This is not a story of evil for shock or fear. It's the story of a human being who became something unrecognizable, and the system that failed to see it coming. This is Ed Kemper, the co-ed killer, a mind too smart for mercy. Before the headlines, before the interviews and the fear, there was just a boy, tall, quiet, and deeply alone. Edmund Emil Kemper III was born on December 18, 1948, in Burbank, California. He was the third child of Clarnell and Edmund Kemper Jr. His father was a World War II veteran who later worked in atomic testing for the Air Force, a man hardened by duty, detached from emotion. His mother, Clarnell, was intelligent but demanding, a woman known for her sharp tongue and restless temper. Their home was not filled with warmth. Arguments replaced affection, and the distance between husband and wife grew until eventually it broke. When Ed was 9, his parents divorced. His father left for good, and Ed, the youngest, stayed behind with his mother. For many children, a parent's love softens the world. For Ed, his mother's voice became the world, and that voice often told him he was worthless. She feared his size and temper and forced him to sleep in the basement, away from his sisters. Down there, he said, he felt surrounded by shadows. He remembered lying awake, listening to the sound of her footsteps above him. Every creak of the floorboards a reminder that he didn't belong. Alone, he began to build an imagination that turned dark. He played strange games, pretending to die, staging mock funerals for his sister's dolls. By age 10, Ed was already over 5 feet tall, but emotionally he was adrift, growing in body, not in peace. When he hurt small animals, he later claimed, it wasn't out of anger, it was curiosity. He wanted to understand control, life, and the moment it ended. In his mind, control meant safety. By the time he reached his early teens, that curiosity had hardened into something colder. Ed wanted to escape Helena, Montana, escape his mother's contempt, escape himself. But the pain that began in that basement would follow him wherever he went. At 15, Ed Kemper had already grown into an intimidating figure. Tall, quiet, withdrawn. But inside, resentment was boiling. He had begun to imagine what it might feel like to turn that resentment outward, to take control of the pain that had been controlling him his whole life. In the spring of 1964, Ed was sent to live with his paternal grandparents on a remote farm in North Fork, California. His mother said she couldn't handle him anymore. To Ed, it felt like being discarded, again. His grandfather, Edmund Sr., was a quiet, patient man. His grandmother, Maud, was strict, sharp, and often scolded him. To them, he was simply a troubled boy. To Ed, they became the latest symbols of everything that rejected him: authority, control, judgment. One August afternoon, the pressure snapped. In a moment of rage and confusion, Ed took his grandfather's hunting rifle and shot his grandmother in the kitchen. When his grandfather returned home from the store, Ed met him outside and did the same, later saying he didn't want his grandfather to see what had happened. He then called his mother. Calmly, he told her what he had done, and on her instruction, he called the police. When the sheriff arrived, the boy didn't resist. He was 15, towering, emotionless, and eerily polite. Psychiatrists later diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia and sent him to Atascadero State Hospital, a maximum security facility for the criminally insane. There, doctors expected to meet a violent, uncontrollable youth. Instead, they found a boy with a high IQ, 136, articulate, cooperative, even charming. He studied psychology, assisted in administering tests, and learned the language of mental illness so fluently that doctors began to trust him. He learned the system and how to speak its language. It was knowledge he would later use in ways no one could imagine. In 1969, after 5 years inside Atascadero, staff psychiatrists recommended his release. They reported that he had shown improvement, that he no longer posed a danger to others. The system listened. At 21 years old, Ed Kemper was released into the custody of his mother, Clarnell, who by then lived in Santa Cruz, California. It was a decision that would have tragic consequences. The same home, the same arguments, the same cold voice. Everything he thought he had escaped came rushing back. His mother still belittled him, mocked his social awkwardness, told him no woman would ever want him. He tried to live a normal life. He attended community college. He dreamed of becoming a police officer, but was rejected because of his size. 6'9", nearly 300 pounds. Still, he socialized with local officers at a bar called the Jury Room, where they nicknamed him Big Ed. To them, he was harmless, a friendly giant with a curious interest in law enforcement. No one suspected what was brewing behind the calm smile. He began to collect guns again. He installed a police radio in his car. He imagined power, control, and revenge. But this time, his anger wasn't directed at authority figures. It turned toward women who reminded him of the rejection he felt his whole life. In his mind, he began to rewrite the story of his pain, and soon the world around him would pay the price. Co-ed killer emerges. The year was 1972. Santa Cruz, California was a college town filled with peace signs, bicycles, and students chasing new freedom along the coast. To most people, it was a place untouched by danger. To Ed Kemper, it was a landscape of opportunity, an open world where he could pretend to belong. He had grown fascinated by the hitchhikers who crowded Highway 1 and the winding roads around the university. Young women, books in hand, trusting strangers for rides. He watched them often, wondering why they seemed so unafraid. Ed began to pick them up, at first just to talk. He practiced conversation, asked about their lives, and let them go unharmed. Each successful trip convinced him he could control the darkness inside. But each time, the urge to cross the line grew stronger. In May 1972, that control finally collapsed. Two Fresno State students, Marianne Pesce and Anita Luchessa, accepted a ride from him. They never returned. By the next day, Ed had taken their lives. He disposed of the evidence with a chilling calm, returning home to his mother's house as if nothing had happened. No one suspected him. To the outside world, he was still Big Ed, the polite man who loved to chat with the police. He even carried student identification cards belonging to the women, in case officers stopped him. Months later, in September, he struck again. A 15-year-old girl named Aiko Koo disappeared after missing her bus in Berkeley. Ed offered her a ride. This time, he tried to reason with her. He said later he wished she hadn't been afraid, but his compassion was a flicker that died almost instantly. When it was over, he felt the same emptiness he always had. He began to realize something that terrified him. He wasn't killing out of anger anymore. He was killing because he could. For the next year, Ed lived two separate lives. By day, he was the quiet man who shared coffee with police officers. By night, he became a predator on the open roads. He learned to avoid suspicion. He checked police bulletins, changed his routes, and studied forensic techniques he'd learned inside a Tascadero. Between 1972 and 1973, he would claim the lives of 6 young women, students and travelers, each trusting a stranger who seemed safe. The newspapers called it a string of disappearances. The police called it a mystery, and Santa Cruz called it unthinkable. What no one knew was that the man they were looking for was already sitting at the next bar stool, listening quietly to their theories. By early 1973, Ed Kemper's life had become a quiet performance. Each morning he greeted his mother before work. Each night he returned to the same house that had once been his childhood prison. And in between, he lived 2 lives, one ordinary, one monstrous. He still frequented the jury room, the same bar where off-duty police officers gathered. He bought them drinks, listened to their theories, nodded thoughtfully as they spoke about the co-ed killer. They had no idea they were sharing beers with him. Inside, Ed felt a strange sense of power, not from the violence itself, but from the fact that no one could see it. He controlled his image completely. He was invisible, even in plain sight. Yet something within him was shifting. The rush that once followed his crimes was fading, replaced by exhaustion and an unbearable sense of emptiness. He began to drink heavily, driving through the night to quiet his thoughts. Still, the pattern continued. Each act felt less about desire and more about routine, a grim repetition, as if he were trying to prove to himself that he still had control. But control was slipping away. His relationship with his mother grew worse. She criticized everything: his job, his friends, even the way he breathed. He moved out for a time, finding brief independence, but he always came back. The emotional pull of that house, that voice, was too strong. By the spring of 1973, the killings had become almost mechanical. He no longer sought thrill, he sought silence. And the only person left who could fill that silence was her. The anger he had buried since childhood began to surface again, sharper, heavier, aimed directly at the woman who had shaped his pain. To Ed, it began to feel inevitable. The story, he thought, had to end where it began. On the night of April 20th, 1973, Ed came home from a night of drinking. His mother was awake, reading in bed. As he passed her door, she looked up and said, "I suppose you're going to stay up all night talking again." He replied softly, "Good night, Mom." It would be the last thing she ever heard him say. The next morning, Ed did the unthinkable. Years of rage, rejection, and resentment came to an end, and with them, his mother's life. In that moment, the figure who had haunted his entire existence was gone. But instead of relief, there was only silence. Later that day, he called his mother's best friend, Sally Hallett, and invited her over for dinner. When she arrived, he took her life as well. A final attempt, he said, to cover what he had done. Then he drove away. For the first time, he didn't run from the police. He didn't hide. He simply left. He drove more than 1,000 miles north to Pueblo, Colorado. Days later, on April 24th, 1973, he stopped at a payphone, called the police, and confessed everything. At first, they didn't believe him. "Big Ed," one officer said, the quiet guy from the jury room. But when he began describing the details only the killer could know, they realized the truth. The man they'd been searching for had turned himself in. When the police arrived, Ed Kemper was waiting, unarmed, calm, almost relieved. He greeted them politely, handed over the car keys, and said, "I'm the one you're looking for." After months of fear and confusion, the investigation that had paralyzed Santa Cruz was suddenly over, solved not by a clue but by a confession. At first, investigators struggled to comprehend it. How could this gentle-spoken man, a familiar face, a friend to officers, be responsible for the string of disappearances that had haunted their town? But Ed made no attempt to hide or justify his actions. He explained them in detail, as though giving a report, his voice steady and detached. In the days that followed, the FBI arrived. Agents wanted to understand how someone so intelligent, so seemingly composed, could commit such acts without remorse. They sat across from him, tape recorders running, asking question after question, and Ed answered every one of them. He talked about his childhood, the loneliness, the basement, the constant rejection. He spoke of his relationship with his mother, calling it the core of everything. He told them that every victim was, in some way, a substitute for her. He didn't excuse himself. He didn't beg for sympathy. He described his actions with clarity, even self-disgust. At times, he seemed to analyze himself as though he were both subject and scientist. To the agents, he was unlike anyone they had ever interviewed. He wasn't driven by chaos or psychosis. He was rational, articulate, aware, a man who could explain his own darkness in perfect detail. One agent later described him as a walking textbook. Another called him a mirror, reflecting the human mind at its most divided. It was those interviews that later shaped the early behavioral profiling work of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit. From Ed Kemper, they learned how some killers could appear entirely normal, even likable, how intellect could disguise pathology. But for Ed, there was no comfort in his cooperation. He said he turned himself in because he was tired. Tired of running from his mind. Tired of the silence after every act. I had to stop, he told them, because I knew I couldn't stop myself. In 1973, he was found guilty on 8 counts of first-degree murder. He requested the death penalty, but California had suspended it at the time. Instead, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. When asked what he thought about his punishment, he simply said, "Society's entitled to be protected from me. That's fine." Inside the walls of California Medical Facility in Vacaville, Ed Kemper became what many would never expect, a model inmate. He worked in the library. He recorded audiobooks for the blind. He read poetry, fixed machines, and followed every rule. To the guards, he was quiet and cooperative. To psychologists, he remained a case study. But to the outside world, he was a reminder. A man whose brilliance and self-awareness could not save him from the darkness that ruled his life. Over the years, reporters and documentarians would come to speak with him. They found a man who still spoke with perfect calm, reflecting on his crimes as though discussing someone else's life. He never denied what he had done. He said he deserved to remain behind bars. He even warned that he should never be released because, in his words, "I can't ever risk it again." For decades, he has remained there, aging, reading, existing within concrete and time. And while his name has become a reference in criminal psychology, it is also a haunting reminder of something far deeper. Ed Kemper was not a creature of folklore or myth. He was human. And that truth, that a person capable of conversation, humor, even kindness, could also carry such darkness, is what unsettles us most. It forces us to look not only at the monster, but at the world that shaped him, the neglected child, the broken family, the systems that believed intellect equaled healing. None of these justify his actions, but they remind us that monsters are not born in isolation. They grow in the cracks of human failure. When we speak of these crimes, we must remember the lives that were lost. Bright, young women with futures, voices and dreams that deserve to continue. Their names are not just part of a case file. They are the reason this story matters. Because to remember them is to make sure that behind every headline, behind every analysis, we never forget the cost of indifference and the fragile line that separates the ordinary from the unthinkable. Edmund Emil Kemper III remains behind bars, and through his story, we are left with a question that has no easy answer. How does a mind so intelligent, so aware, lose all mercy. This has been Ed Kemper, the co-ed killer, a mind too smart for mercy. Thank you for watching. If you find the video interesting, please subscribe, like, and share, because it means a whole lot. Goodbye.